Even before the first spacecraft had orbited our planet, people were thinking about how we can send missions to Mars. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the major plans that have come up with over the years to explore Mars. My name is Ben Pearson and I am the Roadster Tracker. So there have been a number of missions throughout the history to colonize or visit the Red Planet. These are some of the major ones that primarily NASA has pursued, although not all of them have had NASA support. We're going to talk about all of these and some other ones as well. The first plan to getting to Mars that had any serious technical study was done by Wernher von Braun in 1952. He released his proposal to get there. It would take thousands of launches and would send hundreds of people to go explore the Red Planet, but it was a possibility even then that he had designed, at least on paper, although we have far better rocket technology today than he did then. His plan, as mentioned, would result in thousands of spacecraft. It had lots of finned orbital craft, had lots of orbiting space stations and all kinds of infrastructure in order to visit the Red Planet that most of which things we don't really think we need today. Throughout the 1960s, increasing plans were created, primarily using the Saturn V rocket in order to get to the Moon and Mars. And some of them would require some futuristic technologies that we don't necessarily have today. They would require multiple launches of the Saturn V, as many as 8, and they would send multiple ships during one particular pass, so it could involve a large number of missions, perhaps the expense of the entire Apollo program just to send one mission to Mars, but it was at least theoretically possible. Many of these relied on futuristic technologies such as the Nerva rocket that you can see on the left and the nuclear reactor that was used in space. And these things were, while they did have some existence, and some of them even, the United States tested at least one nuclear reactor in space, and the Soviet Union tested many. They haven't been hugely used, and they're still kind of exotic. But there were all kinds of plans that were made using these. Perhaps the most well-known plan that came out from the 1960s was the Wernher von Braun plan in 1969, same year that we landed on the Moon. He created a very complex proposal that would involve going to Mars in 1982, and it would primarily use the Saturn V rocket. It would take 7 launches to assemble a rocket in space. One part would be the Mars spacecraft, the thing that would actually land on the surface of Mars. So the rest of it would be nuclear-powered spacecraft, rockets, that would enable it to get to Mars and also back from there as a space tug. And it would use all kinds of space shuttles. And this plan is much, much better developed than the 1952 plan that he had, because we actually understood a little bit about the atmosphere of Mars, and we realized it was much, much thinner than it was there. So we knew that the winged spacecraft that we were talking about sending in the 1950s and early 60s simply would not work. For much of the 1970s and 1980s, there was a very strong deficit of anything related to space technology. The only thing that was done really was the creation of the space shuttle, along with the space station, other space station testing efforts and things like that, but it hadn't really had a very strong presence in space. Much of that changed in 1989 when President Bush, the elder George H.W. Bush, ordered a NASA to do a review that has been since called the 90-day study. And one of the things that was proposed was the space station Freedom out of that report. It also contained a proposal on getting to Mars that was kind of similar to the Wernher von Braun plan. Now, this is the first plan that I've been able to find that proposes any kind of in situ resource utilization, which is now believed to be key to exploring Mars, namely using the resources that are already available there. but it was only talking about using it for air and water and structural stuff and not for fuel, which comes up in later missions. This plan was deemed to be so expensive that it was really not considered feasible. Um, and in those days, they estimated the cost to get to Mars at about $400 billion, which is absolutely unattainable. This plan, even though it's been largely scrapped, there are definitely elements that can be seen today. And in my opinion, it is still the primary plan on getting to deep space exploration. You can see elements of it, such as the International Space Station, instead of the Space Station Freedom, that are still in use today. And the still general steps of going back to the moon and Mars as it proposed are in effort today. Now, in 1990, as a result to counter this, was proposed a new method, which is perhaps the most obtainable method to getting to Mars. It was proposed by Robert Zubrin, and that plan is called the Direct Mars Approach. Direct Mars Approach, unlike every other mission before, relied on 2 launches in order to get to Mars. Just 2. Those 2 launches would be the first year you send the return ship, have it land on Mars, and it lands fairly light, but it's able to use the atmosphere of Mars to produce methane and oxygen, which can be used as rocket fuel. That rocket would then be fully refueled, and then the next time you send a manned spacecraft, you have to land relatively close to your landing site. But these are landing ellipses that even back then we were able to do, and we're much more able to do them today. The spacecraft that contained the humans would also contain a rover that would allow them to transfer all the way over there if they landed too far away. And so in so doing this, they would be able to get to their return vehicle and should be safe. And it had a lot of other different backups to make this work. This plan was written into a full-length book that is known as The Case for Mars, that I will provide a link to in the description of this video so you can check and look at it. I highly, highly recommend this. This plan, while it's not perfect in my opinion, it is the most well-formed plan, and most modern plans rely on at least some element of this. But this brought the cost of a mission to Mars from $400 billion down to something more along the lines of $30 billion, which is much, much more obtainable, the budget of NASA for a couple of years. And each reoccurring mission to Mars would be on the order of $2 to $4 billion. So much, much more obtainable. So here we have an artist rendition. You can see there's really just 2 spacecraft that landing. You have the habitat that the humans arrived on, and you have the return vehicle on the left. And they each have various supplies. They have some proposals as how you divvy out the supplies between the 2 spacecraft, but really that's all there is to it. And this is from the original proposal that you can also see some of the stuff that might be carried with it. So using this plan, NASA decided to go use some of the principles of this plan, but also continue to expand it. Something between the 90-day study plan to get to Mars and Mars Direct in its simplicity. And so they called this Mars Semi-Direct, which really involves it involves 3 launches per orbit, or per orbital alignment that happens every 26 months. Instead of the 2 that Mars Direct does, but it's still far, far cheaper. And it has a couple of extra safety features built in that make it a lot more palatable to the risk-adverse NASA. And here you can see another image of what that plan might look like. This is the Constellation program that was developed in 2009 with the assistance of largely another George W. Bush, the junior. You could see that it has a lot of similarities to the Mars Direct program. And in fact, it even uses the Ares 5 vehicle, which is actually proposed in the the case for Mars. A lot of these elements have been kind of considered, but they've been scrapped to some extent. But you can see the Orion spacecraft came out of this that is currently being talked about used with the SLS. But they still haven't figured out all of the pieces here. And one of the problems you see here is every 8 to 12 years, we seem to come up with a new one of these directives on getting humans to Mars, and then some new president comes along and says, oh, let's get back to Mars, and they'll propose a new plan that's in a slightly different direction. And while we're making some progress, it doesn't necessarily get us there. The current plans revolve around the SLS vehicle, although they still haven't figured out the exact architecture on getting us to there. So this is the SLS, still hasn't launched. It's way behind schedule and way over budget. But this is the current vehicle that they're thinking can take us into deep space. An alternative to that that's happened in recent years, and we'll be talking a lot more about this plan and also the SLS vehicle in general, is plans that have come out by private companies, the most notable version of which is the SpaceX plan to land humans on Mars at some point in time in the next 5 to 10 years, which is considerably more. It's further along in the technology and also much more developed than some of the other programs that are out there. Thank you very much for joining me on this journey. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have about this or anything else. Let me know if there's any topics in particular along the space exploration mission. If there's a particular mission that you'd like to know more about, and I might do a video on that while I go on through the series. Take care, and until next time, keep on tracking.